Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. Before I begin, I want you to consider something for a moment. When was the last time you heard a government official actually tell you the truth about why powerful nations do what they do? When was the last time someone in a position of authority pulled back the curtain and showed you the real machinery of international politics? Well, my friends, that rare moment has just occurred, and we need to pay very close attention to it. Colombian President Gustavo Petro has done something remarkable. In a recent interview with CNN, he stated plainly what many of us have known for decades, but what official Washington refuses to acknowledge. Speaking about the Trump administration's aggressive military posture toward Venezuela, Petro declared that oil is at the heart of the matter. He argued that the administration is not thinking about democratizing Venezuela, nor is it genuinely concerned with narco trafficking. It's about oil. Three simple words that cut through mountains of propaganda, justifications, and carefully crafted narratives. It's about oil. Now, let me walk you through why these matters, not just for Venezuela, not just for Latin America, but for all of us who want to understand how capitalism shapes global politics. Venezuela sits atop the largest proven oil reserves in the world. We're talking about roughly 303 billion barrels of oil, more than Saudi Arabia, more than any other nation on earth. Think about what that means in a world where oil remains the lifeblood of industrial capitalism. Think about what that means when the United States, despite being a major producer itself, still views energy resources as strategic assets to be controlled, not just consumed. Here's where the economic analysis becomes crucial. Venezuela's oil isn't just sitting there unused. Under Hugo Chavez and continued under Nicolás Maduro, the Venezuelan government nationalized the oil industry through PDVSA, the state oil company. They used oil revenues not primarily to enrich foreign corporations or a small domestic elite, but to fund social programs, to subsidize basic necessities, to redistribute wealth to the poorest Venezuelans. Was the execution perfect? No. Was there corruption and mismanagement? Absolutely. But the fundamental economic orientation was clear. Oil wealth should belong to the Venezuelan people, not to ExxonMobil, not to Chevron, not to multinational capital. And this, my friends, is the unforgivable sin in the eyes of Washington. It's not really about democracy. If it were about democracy, the United States wouldn't be the staunchest ally of Saudi Arabia, one of the most authoritarian regimes on the planet. It's not really about drugs either. President Petro pointed out something vital. Colombia, not Venezuela, produces the vast majority of cocaine in the region. According to United Nations data, Venezuela isn't even a significant cocaine producer. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration's own reports confirm that 84% of cocaine seized in the United States comes from Colombia. If the war on drugs were genuine, the military operations would be focused entirely differently. But here's what Petro exposed with stunning clarity. The Trump administration imposed sanctions on him, revoked his visa, and accused him of involvement in drug trafficking, even though his government has seized record amounts of cocaine. Meanwhile, Venezuela, which doesn't produce significant quantities of drugs according to international monitors, faces military threats and economic warfare. The logic becomes obvious once you strip away the rhetoric. Petro's Colombia, despite its drug problem, isn't sitting on 303 billion barrels of oil controlled by a government Washington finds ideologically unacceptable. Venezuela is. Let's talk about what this means in terms of imperial politics, because that's what we're really discussing here. The United States has a long, well-documented history of intervening in Latin America whenever governments there attempt to assert control over their own natural resources. In 1953, the CIA orchestrated a coup in Guatemala after the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz attempted land reform that threatened United Fruit Company's interests. In 1973, the U.S. supported the military coup that overthrew Salvador Allende in Chile, partly because he nationalized copper mines. In 1954, 1961, 1964, and throughout the Cold War era, Washington intervened repeatedly to ensure that Latin American resources remained available to American corporate interests. What we're witnessing with Venezuela is simply the 21st century version of this pattern. The justifications change, the propaganda evolves, the methods adapt, but the underlying economic logic remains constant. Capital must expand, resources must be controlled. Governments that prioritize their own populations over the interests of multinational corporations must be punished, destabilized, or destroyed. President Petro's statement that the United States cannot be considered an empire but should be one nation among others is powerful precisely because it challenges the assumption that has governed hemispheric relations for over a century, the assumption that Washington has the right to determine who governs in Latin America, who controls resources, and what economic systems are acceptable. This assumption, this imperial presumption, is what President Petro is pushing back against, and it's why he himself has faced sanctions and diplomatic punishment. Now, I want to address something important here. None of this means that the Maduro government in Venezuela is beyond criticism. Petro himself acknowledged that Venezuela has a democracy problem. Authoritarian practices, restrictions on opposition voices, economic mismanagement, these are real issues. But we must be clear-eyed about something. U.S. sanctions have devastated the Venezuelan economy. When you cut a nation off from international financial systems, when you seize its foreign assets, when you make it nearly impossible for that country to sell its primary export, you create economic catastrophe. Then, when that catastrophe produces hunger and suffering, you point to it as evidence that socialism doesn't work. It's a cynical, brutal strategy, and it's been deployed repeatedly throughout history. Here's what a genuine concern for Venezuelan democracy would look like. It would respect Venezuelan sovereignty. It would allow Venezuelans to determine their own political future without external coercion. It would lift sanctions that primarily harm ordinary people rather than government officials. It would support dialogue and negotiation rather than military threats. But that's not what we see. Instead, we see military deployments in the Caribbean, strikes on vessels that kill dozens of people, and open discussions about ground operations. This isn't about promoting democracy. This is about regime change to facilitate resource extraction. The irony, of course, is that Venezuela's oil is mostly extra, heavy crude from the Orinoco Belt, which is expensive and technologically challenging to extract and refine. It requires specialized infrastructure, significant investment, and expertise. Under sanctions and economic warfare, Venezuela's production has collapsed. But here's the thing. International oil companies possess exactly the technology needed to extract that oil. The moment a government friendly to Washington takes power in Caracas, you can bet those companies will be back. Contracts will be signed, and Venezuelan oil will flow toward maximizing corporate profits rather than funding social programs. President Petro's exposure of these dynamics is important for another reason. It demonstrates that alternative voices exist within Latin American leadership, voices willing to challenge the narrative that Washington and the corporate media present as inevitable truth. When a sitting president of a major Latin American nation states plainly that U.S. policy is driven by oil interests rather than humanitarian concerns, it creates space for more honest conversation about international relations. The broader lesson here extends beyond Venezuela It's about understanding how capitalism functions on a global scale. Resources are not distributed equally. Economic power is not distributed equally. And those nations that control capital, technology, and military force will always seek to ensure access to resources, markets, and investment opportunities. This is not conspiracy theory. This is how the system works, how it has always worked. Adam Smith understood this. Lenin understood this. Every serious analyst of capitalism understands this. What makes our current moment particularly dangerous is the combination of declining U.S. hegemony and the desperate attempts to maintain it. As China rises, as alternative economic arrangements emerge, as the unipolar moment fades, Washington becomes more, not less, aggressive in asserting control over strategic resources. Venezuela's oil, Iran's oil, Iraq's oil, these are not just commodities. They are sites of geopolitical struggle, flashpoints where economic interests clash with national sovereignty, where the logic of capital accumulation confronts the aspirations of peoples for self-determination. So what do we do with this information? How do we respond to President Petro's truth-telling? First, we must educate ourselves and others about the real dynamics of international relations, moving beyond the sanitized narratives fed to us by mainstream media. Second, we must support movements and voices in Latin America and elsewhere that challenge imperial domination. Third, we must connect these international struggles to our own domestic fights for economic justice, because they are part of the same system. The capitalism that demands cheap oil from Venezuela is the same capitalism that suppresses wages, cuts social programs, and concentrates wealth in the hands of the few here at home. President Petro has given us a gift, clarity, in an age of endless spin, manufactured consent, and carefully managed public discourse. Someone in a position to know has simply told the truth. It's about oil, not democracy, not drugs, not humanitarian concern. It's about oil, and it's about who gets to control the wealth that oil generates. Will it be the Venezuelan people, imperfect and struggling as they are to build something different? Or will it be the multinational corporations and the imperial power structure that has dominated this hemisphere for over a century? The answer to that question will be determined not just by military might or economic coercion, but by our willingness to see through the propaganda, to stand in solidarity with those fighting for sovereignty, and to imagine and fight for a world organized around human needs rather than private profit. President Petro has shown us what's really happening. The question now is, what are we going to do about it? Thank you very much.